අද්විතීය 200 Mbps ස්පීඩ් එකකින් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ වේගවත්ම සහ පුළුල්තම හෝම් බ්‍රෝඩ්බෑන්ඩ් සම්බන්ධතාවය වන SLT Mobitel දේශීය ෆයිබර් බලවේගය ඔබත් අදම අත්විඳින්න.
හරිම සුදුයි.
Tonight on First at 9, this Tuesday, the 25th of July, 2023. Towards efficiency, an expert committee to obtain recommendations for a complete restructure of Sri Lanka Railways. Inclusive recovery. The UN assures to remain committed to working with the Sri Lankan government for a sustainable economic recovery. Social security. Sri Lanka to sign agreement with the World Bank to obtain a $200 million loan grant to support the country's social security program as 3 components.
Alliance Finance මෙතුරු රන්නයි සේවාවෙන් රන් පවුම්කට රුපියල් 1,70,000ක ඉහළ අත්තිකාරම.
ඔබේ විශ්වාසය දෙනු සෙන්සුරයින් දැන් ළඟමැති ෆාමසියෙන් ලබාගත හැක.
This is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to First at 9. I'm Shanella Fernando in your top stories for tonight. Newly appointed United Nations President Coordinator in Sri Lanka, Marc-Andre Frange, assures that the UN would remain committed to working alongside the Sri Lankan government for an inclusive and sustainable economic recovery. During a meeting with President Ranil Wickremesinghe, the significance of the United Nations assistance in ensuring fair debt treatment during Sri Lanka's restructuring process was also acknowledged.
The newly appointed United Nations Resident Coordinator in Sri Lanka, Marc-Andre Frange, paid a courtesy call to President Ranil Wickremesinghe last afternoon. The President's media office said the UN Resident Coordinator engaged in dialogue with President Ranil Wickremesinghe on matters of utmost importance for Sri Lanka's economic stability and growth. In a statement, the United Nations office in Sri Lanka said the resident coordinator, Marc-Andre, assured that the UN would remain committed to working alongside the government for an inclusive and sustainable economic recovery, with a particular emphasis on the most vulnerable. He had also reaffirmed commitment of the UN country team to continue working together with the government and people of Sri Lanka towards the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Meanwhile, the President's office said both parties acknowledged the significance of the role the UN could play in assisting Sri Lanka in ensuring equitable debt treatment as the country undergoes a restructuring process to overcome financial challenges and foster sustainable development. In addition, the UN office in Colombo said national commitments of Sri Lanka on the climate agenda, as well as the continued efforts aimed at reconciliation, human rights and development initiatives, including in the northern and eastern provinces, were also discussed.
An expert committee to obtain recommendations to restructure Sri Lanka Railway Services is to be appointed soon. The Cabinet of Ministers advised the President's Secretary to appoint individuals but subject expertise to the committee in order to obtain appropriate proposals to restructure the loss-making department under a suitable model. Speaking to media this morning, Cabinet spokesperson Dr. Bandula Gunawardena said privatizing Sri Lanka Railways is not necessary. However, a structural reform must take place in order to maintain the service.
Yesterday, around 35 train commutes were cancelled due to the protest carried out by the Train Drivers Association after a strike began on Sunday evening. The protest was, however, called off during the course of the day yesterday following discussions with the authorities. Minister of Railways Bandula Gunawardena meanwhile vowed strict action against the protesters who inconvenienced the general public. During today's cabinet media briefing, spokesperson Dr. Bandulu Gunavarthana outlined the decision taken at yesterday's cabinet meeting.
එවන් කාල සීමාවක් තුළ ඔබතුමා ඊයේ කැබිනට් සංදේශයක් ඉදිරිපත් කළා දුම්රිය අධිකාරියක් හෝ දුම්රිය සමාගමක් බවට පත් කිරීමට. මේ පාඩු ලබන දුම්රිය දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව කවදාද එතුමා පුද්ගලික අංශයට බාර දෙන්නේ?
මේක මගේ පුද්ගලික අදහස සම්පූර්ණයෙන් පුද්ගලීකරණය කිරීමක් කරන්න මගේ කිසිම අදහසක් නැහැ. අපිට මේක ගොඩ ගන්න පුළුවන්. ප්‍රතිව්‍යුහගතකරණයක් කරන්න ඕනේ. ඒ කිරීම ලෝකේ අපිත් සමග ඇවිල්ලා අපිට වඩා දියුණු වෙච්ච දුම්රිය සේවයේ තියෙන අසල්වැසි රට තමයි ඉන්දියාව. මොකද ඉන්දියාවෙත් ලංකාවෙත් දුම්රිය සේවය ඇති කරනු ලැබුවේ බ්‍රිතාන්‍ය යටත් විජිත යුගයේ. ඉන්දියාව නිදහසින් පස්සේ අපි දෙගොල්ලම එකට නිදහස ලැබලා ගව් ගණනක් ඈතින් බුලට් ට්‍රේන් දුවන තත්වයට දුම්රිය සේවය දියුණු කරලා තිබෙනවා. අපිට එසේ කරන්න බැරි වෙලා තියෙන්නේ මේක ව්‍යුහාත්මක ගැටලුවක් තිබෙන නිසා. ඒක අපි දකින සරල මට්ටමට වඩා එයා සම්බන්ධිත විශේෂඥ දැනුමක් ඇති ඉංජිනේරුවරු විශ්වවිද්‍යාලවල මේ ප්‍රවාහන ක්ෂේත්‍රයේ පිළිබඳ විද්වත් ආචාර්ය මහාචාර්යවරු වෙනත් රටවල ඉන්න ජාත්‍යන්තර මට්ටමේ ලොජිස්ටික් පිළිබඳ උපදේශකයන් යනාදියකින් අදහස් තොරතුරු විමසලා වඩා ගැළපෙන මොඩල් එක කුමක්ද කියලා අපි වාර්තාවක් කැබිනට් මණ්ඩලයට දෙන්න කියලා කැබිනට් මණ්ඩලය විසින් කැබිනට් ලේකම්තුමා ජනාධිපති ලේකම්තුමා විසින් ළඟදී කමිටුවක් පත් කරයි. ඒ කමිටුවට අපි සියලු දෙනාගෙන් දේශපාලනඥයන්ගෙන් දේශපාලන නොවන අයගෙන් ඒ සේවාව ලබා ගන්න අයගෙන් සේවාවේ ප්‍රගතිය දකින්න කැමැති පොදු ජනතාවගෙන් අදහස් උදාස් ලබාගෙන ඇති කළ යුතු වෙනස පිළිබඳ කඩිනම් වාර්තාවක්.
Meanwhile, Sri Lanka Transport Board has added 175 buses to its service after repairing abandoned buses. They had been taken out of the service due to the lack of spare parts as a result of the country's import restrictions. The buses were restored at a cost of nearly 300 million rupees. It is reported that the goal was to refurbish 400 out of 852 buses that had been out of service for over 3 years. Engineers and technicians of the technical department of Sri Lanka Transport Board had carried out the repair work. Out of the 175 buses, 15 will be allocated to the Sisusaria program, serving as transportation for school children, while the remaining buses will be handed over to respective depots to fulfill passenger transportation needs. Meanwhile, the Cabinet of Ministers gave its approval to sign an agreement with the World Bank to obtain a $200 million loan grant to support the country's social security program as 3 components, including $185 million to assist the Aswasuma welfare beneficiaries. Cabinet spokesperson Dr. Bandulu Gunavarthana said many in need could lose the benefit if Sri Lanka fails to receive the World Bank grant. The loan is provided in line with the World Bank's country partnership framework, which will provide a $500 million loan for budgetary support.
අස්වැසුම නව සුබසාධන ප්‍රතිලාභ ගෙවීමේ ක්‍රමයට සහාය වීම පිණිස ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් මිලියන 185ක් තෝරාගනු ලබන ප්‍රතිලාභීන්ට ආර්ථික වශයෙන් සවිමත් කිරීමේ නියම ව්‍යාපෘතියක් ක්‍රියාත්මක කිරීම සඳහා සහාය වශයෙන් ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් මිලියන 7කුත් समस्त व्यापෘතිය කළමනාකරණය සමාජ ආරක්ෂණ පද්ධතිය ශක්තිමත් කිරීම සඳහා ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් මිලියන 8කුත් වශයෙන් සංරචක 3ක් යටතේ ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් මිලියන 200ක් අරමුදල් සපයා දීමට ලෝක බැංකුව එකඟතාවය පළ කරලා තිබෙනවා. නිදහසින් පස්සේ ලංකා ඉතිහාසයේ සමාජ ආරක්ෂණ සුබසාධනය සඳහා ලෝක බැංකුවෙන් ප්‍රදානය කර තිබෙන වැඩිම මුදල් ප්‍රමාණය තමයි මේ ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් මිලියන 200ක්. ශ්‍රී ලංකා රුපියල් ගත්තොත් රුපියල් මිලියන 66000ක් පමණ අති විශාල මුදල් ප්‍රමාණයක් දිනිඳු ජන කොටස් ඉලක්ක කරගෙන ඔවුන් වඩා නිවැරදිව හඳුනා ගැනීම තුළින් කලින්ට වඩා ලැබුණට වඩා වැඩි ප්‍රතිලාභයක් ඔවුන්ට හිමි වෙන ආකාරයට තමයි අස්වැසුම සමාජ ආරක්ෂණ ව්‍යාපෘතිය ලෝක බැංකුව විසින් අනුමත කරලා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ ගිවිසුමට එළඹීම සඳහා ජනාධිපතිතුමා ඉදිරිපත් කළ යෝජනාවට කැබිනට් අනුමැතිය ලැබුණා. මෙහා සම්බන්ධයෙන් පසුගිය කාලේ විශාල උද්ඝෝෂණ ව්‍යාපාර සංවිධානය කරන්න උත්සාහ දරලා තිබුණා. නමුත් ඇත්ත වශයෙන් වෙලා තිබුණේ ඒ සඳහාත් රජය තම නම්මේශීලී ප්‍රතිපත්තියක් අනුගමනය කළා. සත්‍ය වශයෙන්ම ලැබිය යුතු කෙනෙකුට නොලැබුණා නම් ඒ පිළිබඳ අභියාචනා ඉදිරිපත් කිරීම සඳහාත් කාලයක් ලබා දුන්නා. මෙම මූල්‍ය ප්‍රතිපාදනයේ කෙසේ හෝ ලබා ගැනීම තමයි අතිශයින් වැදගත් වෙන්නේ. ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් මිලියන 200ක් ලෝක බැංකුවෙන් ලැබෙන මුදල නොලැබුණොත් අති විශාල ජනසංඛ්‍යාවකට Tamanට ලබාගත හැකිව තිබෙන ප්‍රතිලාභය නැති වෙනවා.
Sri Lanka plans to complete negotiations on the proposed free trade agreement with Thailand by February next year and sign the agreement in March. Sri Lanka and Thailand have so far held 5 rounds of talks on the proposed FTA, with the most recent talks held from June 26th to 28th. The Cabinet Office said negotiations on the subjects of customs cooperation, trade facilitation, economic cooperation as well as sanitary and phytosanitary had been completed during the last round of talks. Based on the progress of the 5th round of negotiations, Sri Lanka expects the agreement on the Sri Lanka-Thai FTA to be inked by March next year. It was in January this year that officials of the two nations restarted negotiations on the FTA as Sri Lanka focuses on boosting foreign investment, exports and employment in a move to shift gears from tackling the crisis to growth. Sri Lanka also plans to begin free trade talks with Indonesia and restart negotiations with China. The existing free trade agreement with India is also expected to be negotiated for expansion. The National Dengue Control Unit reports of over 55,000 dengue cases in Sri Lanka so far this year. Meanwhile, 52 areas across Sri Lanka have been identified as high-risk areas for dengue, with a total of 27,315 dengue patients reported only from the Western Province. According to the statistics of National Dengue Control Unit, a total of 55,049 dengue cases have been reported from across Sri Lanka, while the total number of deaths reported so far this year stands at 36. Meanwhile, 52 areas across the country have been identified as high-risk areas for dengue. A majority of the cases were recorded from Gampaha district, with 11,929 cases detected. In the Colombo district, 11,833 cases have been detected so far this year, while 3,553 cases were reported from Kalutara district. The National Dengue Control Unit placed the number of cases reported from the Western Province so far at a total of 27,315. Meanwhile, health reports revealed an increasing number of cases from Kandy, Putlam, Ratnapura and Kegol. In the meantime, Sri Lanka saw a novel 9,696 dengue cases being reported in May this year, while 9,916 cases were reported in June. However, this figure gradually decreased, with a total of 5,729 cases reported this month. Meanwhile, taking the inclement weather conditions into account, the National Dengue Control Unit urged the public to take necessary measures to keep their premises free of mosquito breeding places.
As of 25th July, 55,049 dengue patients reported island-wide. For the month of July, 5,729 patients reported, and compared to the last month or the month of June, there is a 40% reduction. If we consider the weekly distribution of dengue patients, the highest number of dengue patients reported in the year, that was more than 2,700 cases. But the last week, that has been declined to 1,500 cases. So there's an obvious reduction in the reporting of dengue patients to the system. But with the continued intermittent raining, the dengue risk still remaining. So National Dengue Control Unit kindly requests from citizens of the country to keep vigilant on mosquito breeding places and take remedial actions to keep their premises free of mosquito breeding.
Meanwhile, the Secretary General of BIMSTEC, Tenzin Lekfel, urges Sri Lanka to take a leading role in the public health sector in the region, while praising the country's commitment to public health. In a meeting with President Ranil Wickremesinghe today, BIMSTEC Secretary General Tenzin Lekfel discussed the need for continued cooperation among member states and emphasized the importance of further developing public health sector in the region. During the meeting, President Wickremesinghe highlighted the necessity of holding regular ministerial level meetings among BIMSTEC members to ensure the organization's success and effective collaboration. BIMSTEC stands for the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, comprising 7 South and Southeast Asian nations. Trade unions engaged in protest opposite the Colombo Fort railway station this morning against government action to prune employees' provident fund and an unfair revision of labour laws. Later, an injunction order was issued by the Fort Magistrates Court preventing the protesters from entering the President's house, the Presidential Secretariat and the Galle Face precinct. However, despite rains, the demonstrations continued. Later, a tense situation arose between the protesters and police when police attempted to prevent the crowd from marching towards the central bank. The Court of Appeal today ordered not to extend an interim order preventing the collection of pay tax from High Court judges. The order was issued upon agreement of the majority of judges of a 5-member judge bench led by the President of the Court of Appeal, Nisanka Bandula Karunaratne, after the case was taken up for consideration today. Nevertheless, the panel of judges unanimously issued an order to hear 3 petitions submitted by the Sri Lanka Judicial Service Association, High Court Judges Association and Labour Court Presidents Association. These petitions seek to overturn the decision to deduct pay tax from the salaries of judges. The Court of Appeal, in addition to directing the issuance of notices to the respondents mentioned in the petitions, also set a deadline for August 31st to allow the filing of any objections pertaining to the case. The scheduled date for the hearing of the petitions is September 22nd. The Sri Lankan rupee shifts from best performing currency 6 months ago to the worst in Asia. More news on the other side of this break. Stay with us.
ගොඩමඩ පෙරලි කරන බලපුළුවන්කාරයා මහින්ද්‍රා යුවෝ ටීමෝ වෙතින්. වැඩම ගොඩයි ගොඩම තමයි. ස්වරාජ් ට්‍රැක්ටර් ටීමෝ වෙතින්. අපේ ගෙදරත් ආපිකෝ මෙට්‍රස් තමයි. මාදිලි රසකින් යුත් මෙට්ටලුවේ ප්‍රමුඛයා. ආපිකෝ මෙට්‍රස් සැපනින්දට සැප මෙට්ට.
Welcome back in business news. The Colombo Bourse closed in negative territory for a second consecutive session today, mainly dragged down by the quarterly performance of Lanka Indian Oil Corporation in the June quarter and profit-taking in banking sector counters. The benchmark all-share price index fell 0.22% to end at 11,069.44, while the more liquid S&P SL20 was down 0.6% to settle at 3,319.99. Market turnover crossed 2.5 billion rupees, with a majority of the revenue coming in from the capital goods and food and staples retailing sectors. Foreign investors were net buyers, purchasing stocks worth 205 million rupees, while domestic investors were net sellers, offloading shares worth 205 million rupees. The Sri Lankan rupee has turned into Asia's worst performing currency from being the best in the first half of the year. Bloomberg Media reported that the Sri Lankan rupee is poised to extend losses amid headwinds from interest rate cuts and loosening of import controls. The currency has tumbled more than 6% this month as it fell for the 14th day yesterday, on track for its longest daily losing streak in almost 5 years. That's a stark reversal from the Sri Lankan rupee's performance in the first 6 months of the year, when the rupee was Asia's top performer with a 19% advance. Bloomberg reported that the currency may further weaken by 8% by the end of this year. Let's take a look at the day's foreign exchange rates. Oil prices were steady today, hovering near 3-month highs. Signs of tighter supplies and pledges by Chinese authorities to show up the world's second biggest economy lifted sentiments, while weaker Western economic data weighed on the crude market.
Brent futures were down 4 cents and $82.70 a barrel, while US West Texas Intermediate crude was stable at $78.74. The crude benchmarks are on track for their 5th weekly gain in a row, with supplies expected to tighten due to output cuts from the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries and Allies. Earlier load-in Brent contracts are selling above later load-ins, a price structure known as backwardation, indicating traders see tight supply with the 6-month spread near a 2.5-month high. While industry data on US crude inventories is expected later today, it is estimated on average that crude inventories would have fallen by about 2 million barrels in the week to July 21. In China, the world's second-largest economy and second biggest oil consumer, leaders pledged to step up economic policy support, while in the Eurozone, business activity shrank more than expected in July. Investors have priced in quarter-point hikes from the Fed and European Central Bank this week, so the focus will be on what Fed Chair Jerome Powell and ECB President Christine Lagarde say about future rate increases.
With that, we wrap up tonight's edition of First at 9. Thank you for joining. I'm Shanella Fernando. Have a good night.